And it'd be wonderful if I added myself to the screen. Sorry, I had to remove my cat from jumping up. So hello, everybody. Let's give this round 2 for the live September book club review of Trapped with Miss Arias, part 1 of 3, getting the file to being ready for the trial by Kirk, Nurmi. So I do have the screen pulled up next to me here, and it looks like the connection is much better. So I'm thinking we're good. I'm thinking we're good to go. All right. So my apologies, everybody, for the technical difficulties on the first one, but let's go ahead and get into this. I am really excited. I am downstairs, so if you do see a cat or two jump up here, my apologies. But then again, like, we're all here for the cats, let's be honest. So before I get going and started with the book and the book review of what I think about it, has anybody already read this book by Kirk Nurmi, or has anybody else, if not read it, maybe listened to it on Audible or whatnot? Let me know. Let me know your thoughts. And as we're going on, this is one of those cases where everybody has a lot to say about it, and it's still kind of fresh in our minds, even though it was a couple of decades ago. So yeah, I'm really excited to jump into it. And what I started to say earlier on the first review video before the internet kind of got a little buggered was I was very fortunate enough and very honored to several months ago be on the Zone 7 podcast that Cheryl McCollum does. We were talking about the Karen Reed trial, and there was several of us on the panel, and one of the people there was Kirk Nurmi. So I was very excited and very honored to be on that with him. And yeah, he is excellent. If you guys are not already following him on social media, please do. He posts quite a bit, and it's pretty cool. So definitely check him out. He's on Facebook, he's on Instagram and whatnot. And yeah, let's go ahead and dive in. I have a lot of notes. I won't tell you how many pages of notes I have, because y'all are gonna be like, Dani, what the heck? But yeah, I have a lot to say about this book. So all right, before we dive in, the very back, let me read that to you so you all kind of get a gist of what the author Kirk is going to be describing what the book is about. So after earning his law degree from the University of Wyoming College of Law, Mr. Nurmi began his legal career in Maricopa County working as a public defender. In this capacity, he vigorously fought to support the rights of indigent defendants for over a decade. Eventually, Mr. Nurmi's opposition to the death penalty led him to work as a capital defense attorney within the Office of the Public Defender. It was in this capacity that in 2009, he was assigned to represent Jodi Ann Arias, a case he would try to leave behind when he went into private practice. Fate had other ideas, and in 2013, he was thrust into the international spotlight. Now, over 5 years after receiving this file, the case is over and life will never be the same. Today, Mr. Nurmi continues to work as a private practitioner and, yes, an author. So this book, when I kind of gave you guys that timeline, if you're thinking, wait a minute, so this book was written and published in 2015. So it is 10 years old. So keep that in mind as I am going through it. And actually some of the comments that I had on the book kind of did relate to how I felt it would have been perceived back in 2015 versus now in 2025. So let's see. So Tish is saying, the first time I heard of Mr. Nurmi's name, I wrote in my notebook. It's unusual. Oh, interesting. Okay, gotcha. Yeah. Okay, I see what you're saying. Okay, I'm just double checking the chat. Yeah, and if anybody has any comments about this as I'm going through, please leave it in the comments, or any questions about it as I'm going through. So again, this book was published in 2015. There are no pictures in the book, although honestly, it doesn't need it. I feel we have seen so much of this case. I don't need to see it again. I don't need to see a single picture of Jodi Arias, nor do I need to see any of the crime scene photos of Travis Alexander, because they were quite gruesome. And I thought that was an interesting author choice that Kirk did, to not put any photos in the book. And I actually think that that made his book, to me as a reader, I felt more connected to it because I wasn't being drawn in by seeing any of the kind of scandalous or more salacious photos. I was just going to hear what Kirk had to say. And that was my sole intent for reading this book anyway. So I liked that. So the book itself is 303 pages. It doesn't look like that. Like, I feel like when I hold up and even here, I'm like, wait, what? But yeah, it is 303 pages. It is divided into 10 sections, 51 chapters. And each chapter itself is only several pages long, which makes the book really easy for somebody to sit and read. Whether you want to, if you're like me and just really like to sit down with a good book and just get lost in it for hours on end, or if you don't have that much time to dedicate to it, there are so many, again, small chapters that you're so easily able to read as much as you can and be like, okay, at this point I need to put the book down to do something else. And you have so many good stopping points in the book. So I felt that was really a good choice on Kirk's part in doing that. So my note right here, right off the bat, before I even get into the book, excellent structure. Excellent structure. So before you even get into the first chapter of the book, there are an acknowledgments section, a forward section, and an introduction section. All three of those were extremely informative, and they grabbed the reader's attention right away. I actually have my comment here, more so than almost every other single book I've read, to be perfectly honest. I don't mean this in a bad way, but a lot of times, you read the introduction or the acknowledgments, and I read every single one, because if an author's going to take the time to write them, I'm going to read them. And a lot of times it's just like the standard thing, thank this person for this, or or whatnot. For some reason, this book's all three sections, acknowledgments, forward, introduction, I just felt almost as though like this could have been part of the book itself. There was so much to it, and they were all actually very, they grabbed the reader on an emotional level that I quite wasn't expecting, and I was very impressed. So right away, I'm like, okay, I'm not even into chapter 1 yet, and I'm hooked. Like, Kirk, the author, already has me hooked, and we haven't even started yet. So that is that. So Kirk, one of the things he does in this kind of intro section is describe what the title of the book and the handcuffs mean. So I won't necessarily give that away. I would like y'all to read this book and get that information for yourself. But I thought that was very interesting. I didn't really put too much thought into it. I just was like, okay, that's the title of the book and the cover. Let's go forward. But when he stopped to say, here's why I did that, here's the choices that I made to do that, I was like, okay, very smart. He also talks about his intentions with writing this book, and he was very clear on that, which I appreciated from a reader perspective, because I'm like, all right, I already know where he wants this to go. He's not trying to say, here's what I want to do, but then go off somewhere else. He was very true throughout the entire book of, here's my intentions. Here's what, as the reader, I want you to get. And thus far, from this first book, he completely delivered. So I put that in itself was very interesting, as it gave insight to the reader before you actually dived into the book itself. So, all right, let's get started. So some of what I'm going to do is describe the sections or kind of highlights in the book or points that I kind of want to make to kind of give structure to the narrative as the book goes along. And as I'm doing that, I will kind of chime in with a little bit of my feedback on that as well. And at the very end of the episode, I will give my kind of, here's overall what I think of the book and do I recommend it, yes or no. So the opener was before getting the file. So and I'm going to quote here, most of you who followed the state of Arizona versus Jody Arias had no idea who I was. until January 2nd, 2013. If you were one of those people who followed the trial before opening statements, you may have heard of me before that exact day, but I think you would be in the minority. And an even smaller amount of you actually knew me before I was assigned to Miss Arias's to be Miss Arias' attorney. Sorry. What that means is that the great majority of you have no idea who I am, no idea where I come from, and no idea of the things that are important to me. What the majority of you know is what you saw on television. I wanted to give you a true sense of who I am. I do in this chapter 1. Who is Nurmi? In an effort to describe for you what the role and or job of lead counsel in any capital case truly involves. I offer you in chapter 2 the ultimate job of a capital defense attorney. In chapter 3, I describe the people who help that attorney do their job, the defense team. Finally, as one of my goals in writing this book is to help prevent others from walking the same path, the path of hurting or killing someone they love. So that right off the bat, again, tells the reader where we're going in this section. And I will say at the beginning of each section of the book, he does that. There'll be a page saying, for example, in this next section will be like 6 chapters. Chapter 20 will be this. And it's like a sentence saying what it is. Chapter 21 will be this, chapter 22, so on and so forth. So right away, you get a little bit more of like, okay, this is what this next section is going to be about. So I'm ready to follow that. So right off the bat with the beginning of the book, Kirk talks about his life before the Jodi Arias case. And I want to make a point to say that throughout the entire book, Kirk never refers to her as Jodi and does not refer to Travis as Travis. It is Miss Arias, Mr. Alexander. And he makes it a point to do that. And he goes over why for each person he makes that choice to do that in this writing. But for intents and purposes for this review, I will just strictly say Jodi and Travis. But please note when you're reading this, Kirk says Miss Arias and Mr. Alexander. So Kirk starts out, again, his life before the Jodi Arias case, how he took his anonymity, not necessarily for granted, but that he didn't appreciate it as much at the time. He didn't realize that something was going to come up and be as big as it was when he took on this case. And all of a sudden, when he took this case, he was so hated only because he was Jodi Arias's attorney. And not even for the person that he was, because again, no one really knew him before this. We learned a lot about Kirk's upbringing, how his grandparents, Stella and Leo, really were the ones that raised Kirk on the day-to-day basis. And his mom and dad would move to the Seattle area shortly after he was born, so that family could assist in raising Kirk because both of his parents were working and went to school. Kirk talks about spending time growing up with his grandparents and how much he really enjoyed that. He talked about being in school when he was young, and he was always good at math. He remembered grade school for him. He came across one day a book in the library about wanting to be a lawyer, and something about that had always stuck with him. This is one of the sections in the book that, for so many little personal levels, I felt I really connected to Kirk on, particularly when he talked about his college experience and when he was working at the grocery store. He went to school and worked while he did that. He wanted to be in the police force, but that didn't really work out, so he went to community college. When he worked at the grocery store, it paid a lot, so he did that at night, went to school in the day, and he got very little sleep doing that. So I, with my college journey, I was always just a very much go-getter. I look back and I'm like, how did I have that much energy? Went to school full-time, worked full-time, kind of paid as I went, but still was involved in a lot of school activities, and something about that kind of drive to be self-sufficient and, kind of navigate your career that way. There was just something about it when I was reading it, and I was like, I relate to him on that. Like, I really relate to that hustle. So that was just my little moment for that. When he graduated from school with a bachelor's degree, it was in criminal justice. He applied to several law schools and didn't get into any of them, unfortunately, and he was absolutely devastated. So he eventually decided to quit the grocery store job, even though he was making really good money at the time, and decided to go to graduate school. He decided to pursue a master's degree in history, but then he realized that was not for him. So he decided to get a second bachelor's degree, this time in psychology. And of course, the second I saw that, I was like, Kirk, I feel you. Like, my heart completely feels you. I mean, y'all know I went to school for psychology. That is my thing. That is my passion, amongst like many other things in life, like cat rescue and all that fun stuff. But yeah, when I was like, all right, he went to school for psychology. Like, I love that. I love that. It's so helpful in every aspect of life, I feel. But when I saw that, I was like, all right, that's going to make him, like, to me, better at what he does because he has that background knowledge in that field. So the change in his academic career is also how he met his wife, whom he married in 1993. After getting married, he eventually got a master's degree, a master's of arts in criminal justice. He then went to work in a residential program for delinquent youth, but that home eventually shut down, so he went back to retail work. Again, that was just another little thing where I was like, okay, me and him just kind of have slightly similar little paths in regards to, I used to work in a residential program when I graduated college, and way back in the day, working, I feel like everybody has worked retail at some point in their life, but I did that as well, paid my dues doing, it gets you that kind of good customer service experience, if you will. But like right away, I was just like, oh my God, Kirk, all right, check the box. We got that in common. Check that box. We have that in common. So right away, again, before we even get into anything Jodi Arias, as a reader, I already feel like I'm getting to know him, but also connected to him because of similar kind of paths in regards to life. So, all right. So he, again, went back to work retail while applying to other law schools. So he applied to 5. He talks about when he received his first acceptance letter in the mail to Gonzaga School of Law. He actually was accepted into more than one school. He decided ultimately to attend the University of Wyoming. After graduating there, he took a job as a law clerk at the Maricopa County Public Defender's Office. He talks about how he loved being a public defender. He took great satisfaction in providing people who couldn't afford a top flight attorney with high quality legal representation. Of course, looking back, if he did leave to start his own law firm at the time that he was looking to do that, and the book gets a lot more into that, so that's kind of why I'm being a little vague here. If he did leave and just start his own firm before he got that file, he would not have been lead co-counsel to Jodi Arias. And he ends that section of the book saying, quote, "Choices have consequences," end quote. So the next section of the book was 1 month before being assigned to being lead counsel for Jodi. Kirk was about 40-something years old, a defense attorney. He had a good reputation amongst his peers. He was married for about 15 years at that point. He talks about his love for dogs. At the time, he had a 4-pound Chihuahua, and I was like, oh my God, like animal lover, like Kirk. All right, check the box. Like me and you have so much in common, right? So again, somebody who has any type of love and passion for animals, I'm already like, you're an amazing person. You're just absolutely an amazing person. So everything was going right in his life on that end. Unfortunately, on regards to things with his family, he had recently lost his grandfather, and his grandmother was suffering and slowly dying from Parkinson's disease. So that was going on in his life at the time. The next chapter talks about, again, before he's handed this file, he talks about what it is to be a defense attorney. What does the job entail? And he goes quite a bit of detail into that. And I found that very helpful from a reader's perspective. Will say again, this was written in 2015. We are in 2025 now. I do think the way defense attorneys are viewed now, just in my opinion, is much different than it was back then. And when I say much different, I mean for the better. I feel and there's still room for growth. So don't get me wrong, but I feel people now have much more of an understanding of what a defense attorney's job is and a much more appreciation. Because unfortunately, and yes, there have been so many trials where people are wrongly convicted or there's a cover up or whatnot, whatever the case is, that there's always been that. Sadly, there will always be that. But I think as technology has grown and we have so much access to true crime and court TV, for example, we get to see so much more of this, and it's so much more available for the viewer where you're like, wait a minute, this is like blatant. This person didn't do that, yet they're being tried or whatnot. So the role of a defense attorney, I feel, has just been more appreciated versus kind of back several, decades ago, where it was just kind of like this, how could you represent this person, instead of like, everybody has the right to legal representation and everybody has the right to a defense attorney. So getting to the simplistic nuts and bolts of what is the job of a defense attorney, I found that very helpful as the reader. Again, I already had a lot of that information just from being so into true crime, but I still learned something from this. And I think everybody could learn something from this to get that perspective. So I found that an excellent way for him to just say, before we even get into Jody, like, let's just talk about what the job entails so you know what my position is and what my role is here. Let's see. He talks about, all right, in regards to death penalty. So he gets into his thoughts on that as well. He believes that the killing of a human being is just wrong when it is done by a citizen versus when it's done by a government whose job it is to serve and protect all citizens. And defense attorneys, their job is to serve on the front lines of the fight against the death penalty. He talks about how some of the heat he received during the time of this trial, that it was in the public, it wasn't anything about him personally, because a lot of people did not know who he was. A lot of the hate that he got was that he was serving somebody like Jody, aka he was serving as the defense attorney for Jody Arias. He was saying he seems to think that someone who serves as a lawyer for defendants support what the clients did. There's that big misunderstanding. And he's saying, absolutely not do I support what my client did. He talks about the difference between appearing to advocate for the client versus advocating for the constitutional rights of their client. So big difference. And again, my note here was I get why back in 2015, the kind of vibe of the book and tone of the book is Kirk really not necessarily being on the defense, but kind of like saying to the reader throughout the book, like, I understand why you're going to think this way at this part, or I understand how you're going to be frustrated at this part, but let me break it down from a legal perspective. And I felt, as I was reading it, I felt just so sad that he, as an author, had to do that so frequently throughout the book. But at the same time, I get why he had to do that. I'm thinking, I'm not the reader that's reading this thinking, how could you? Like, how could you do that? Like, I'm not reading it like that. But I can, back in 2015, I can see how a lot of people would get this book and read that and think that way. So I get that that artistic author choice was made. I just felt bad that it had to be made, that he had to be viewed the way he did. And I wondered when I was reading this, if he published this book in 2025, would it still have to be perceived that way? Could he take out all of those? Yeah, my cat's like, yeah, Luke is right here, just like, all right, oh, there's wires for a microphone. Let me play with them. So yeah, would he have to kind of be almost on the defense so much and say to the reader, like, I understand why you're going to think this way, but let me kind of break it down from a legal perspective as to why X, Y, and Z occurs or whatnot. So that was kind of one of the things I thought throughout the entire book was like, oh, if he published it now, would that make a difference in how he approached my cat? I swear to gosh, why he approached writing it the way he did versus how it would also be perceived. That was just what thought I had. Just see where you guys are. Abnormal Psych is fun. Oh my gosh, Abnormal Psych is such a good class. I still remember my professor for Abnormal Psych, where I sat, what she taught, because I just took it all in. Yeah, love that. All right. So I have to pause this in a second and move my cat out of the area. My apologies. Let's see if I just move this chair here and see if he comes down to sit next to me. So the chapter was a good read. I will say it got into a lot about the subject, talking about how when the government wants to kill one of its citizens, the stakes are even higher, so that the defense must be stronger. And that makes a lot of sense, right? The United States Constitution, Kirk goes into a lot about that in regards to the legality of death penalty cases. And he says the United States Constitution, as interpreted by the United States Supreme Court, demands that every effort must be made to save a person's life when the power of the government is seeking to take their life from them. Basically, if capital defense attorneys did not fight for their clients' lives, the desire to kill goes unchallenged. And seeking a verdict of, quote, not guilty, end quote, really does not come into the picture. That last sentence right there, we're going to get more into that a little bit later in the book because it plays a big part. And so kind of put a pin in that. So, being lead counsel for Jodi Arias, Kirk's job, and really his only job from day one, was to save his client's life, either a trial or by making the right record so as to preclude execution of her down the road. He says, and he makes it very clear here in the book and throughout the entire book. Like, he makes it so crystal clear that no one can walk away and be like, he defended what he believed. He agreed with what she did. No, then you didn't read the book. So he says that he did not and does not support what Jodi did on June 4th, 2008. Kirk was doing his job and trying to save his client's life. And that is what he did. And that was ultimately the job of what a capital defense attorney does. Kirk then goes on to talk about the logistics of a defense team. And this was interesting because I did not know this. And again, he's practicing for this case in Arizona. So he gets into Arizona law. And that dictates that each person who the state tries to execute must have two attorneys, a lead counsel, and a co-counsel. And then discusses what is the difference in the book between a lead counsel position and a co-counsel position. But that's not all. The defense team must also have what's called the investigator position and a mitigation specialist position. And my note right here is, I have never heard of this before. Again, this is for the state of Arizona. And then when he gets into what each position does, I'm like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. I just didn't know that that was a requirement of a defense team in regards to Arizona law here. So that was new to me. So the next chapter talks about how he wishes he never got the Jodi Arias file. And he makes it clear, he's not saying that I wish the case was given to somebody else. He just says he wishes that the murder never happened in the first place. And this chapter, he goes on to discuss how, from his perspective, how this could have been avoided and how someone reading this book might take something away from it where it would lead to something like this just ultimately not happening again in the future. And in regards to his thoughts on that, so I'm going to briefly say what those points were, but in the book, he gets into a lot more detail. So the first issue is mental health. He discusses a lot of the red flags that he saw about Jodi's time growing up, as well as how her family ignored those red flags. and how throughout her life, where all these red flags popped up, she did not seek therapy, nor did her family have her even try to seek therapy. The second point was Jody wanting to be with Travis and him wanting somebody else. He flat out says, ladies, you cannot change guys. Taylor told this time, right? It happens. It's going to happen. It's just one of those, like, again, you're adding all of these pieces to the puzzle, and that's how he saw how this happened. So the next part in this that he kind of gives is Travis ignored his friend's advice to stay away from Jody. They all said she was absolutely crazy. That's one of those things where, like, putting true crime aside, like, we all have those people in our life. And I've always said from day one in regards to friends, family, I'm a no bullshit person. Like, I'm going to say it like it is. And at the end of the day, does that get me in trouble sometimes? Or a lot of the times? Yes, it does. But when you're dating someone, guy, girl, whomever, it's one thing if, like, there's that one friend or one family member that doesn't like them. And it's like, oh, that's too bad. I was hoping they would. That's one thing. But when you're dating somebody and collectively everybody does not like that person, take a step back. Take a step back and be like, there's something to this. Again, in this case, he's just saying, and Kirk makes it very clear, in no way is he victim blaming Travis in any way, shape, or form ever in this book. It's just citing fact that there were so many instances of his friends saying, stay away from her. She is dangerous. And he ignored those warnings. So he talks about how he remembers when he was given the Jodi Arias file from his boss. And ultimately, it was one of those first glances. Okay, well, here's a woman with no criminal history. She's accused of killing her boyfriend. And also in the position when you're a public defender, you can't look at a file and say to your boss, no, I'll pass. No, I'm not going to take that. You can't really do that. So there's that, right? So before Kirk went to meet Jodi, he didn't have all of the file information yet because it was being sent over from somebody who was previously representing her but had to step back. And we will get into that in a bit in the book. So he wanted to get to know as much about her before that file information came. And we all know about Jodi's doing the 48 hours mystery CBS interview, right? So he realized that, okay, well, I can watch this and learn a lot. And he sure did. Kirk realized she would do as she pleased against her attorney's advice. And there was the ninja intruder theory. She said that on TV, even though it was clearly a lie. And when I was reading this, I was like, oh my God, the ninja. I actually wrote my notes, ninja intruder theory, because I totally forgot that back when me and Paul from the Paulcast we covered this case. And when I went to say it, I know, Capone, I literally thought of you when I wrote that, because I can't pronounce anything correctly being from Boston, I literally said in the episode, you can go back and watch it live, ninja intruder. So yes, but ultimately we all know, we've all seen that Jodi Arias interview where she talks about that. And it's very clear it's a lie, but nonetheless, she does it. So Capone, I love it. So now Kirk talks about what he remembers from when he went to meet Jodi for the first time. And he makes it very clear. Back when he first met her, there was no media sensation about her the way that it is now, or the way that it was even at her trial. Yes, she did that 48 hours mystery CBS interview, but before that, she really wasn't in the public eye. So it wasn't like this big, like, oh my gosh, I now have the Jodi Arias, I'm going to go meet her to be her public defender. It wasn't like that. So for him, it was just another part of the job, just another part of a day's work, meeting a client for the first time. And he says right here, reminder, the goal is to save your client's life. Their goal is the client is opposing. And let me explain that, right? So death penalty case, he's saying the goal is to get them not sentenced to death. So most likely they're going to be convicted of first-degree murder. The client has the opposing view thinking, I just want to be found not guilty and being able to just walk right out of court. So there really comes into picture here the perspectives. They're completely different, right? There's Kirk's perspective of here's what the reality of the situation is, and we need to save your life at all costs. And then the defendant's is I just want to walk out of court. But you can kind of see how each side would think that, right? So now let's jump back into more specifics with Kirk and Jodi. So Kirk's initial thoughts on Jodi. She was a very disturbed woman. She tried to flirt with him a lot and then stopped when she realized it wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't working for her. She was polite and chatted with him, not like they were behind bars at a prison, but like, hey, we just met at a coffee shop and let's just kind of sit and chat. That's how it felt. And he also was very clear where he says, she was very much testing me. So now Kirk talks about his review of the evidence in the case once it came in. Quote, the scene told a pretty clear story, a story of unmitigated anger, end quote. And Kirk says, just flat out, this was one of the most gruesome crime scene photos he had ever viewed. Keep in mind, as a defense attorney, he's viewed a lot. So that says a lot, right? Kirk had to consider all possibilities if she was involved. Was it solo? Did she have somebody else assist her with this? Or was she just not involved? At this time, when he is going through all of this, she is still holding on to the ninja intruder story, I should say, story. So a key component of that was to understand who was Jodi Arias as a person. To get to know her as a person and not a murderer, that was much more important to him than what she was saying about the crime. And he talks about how does he get to do this? He starts by observing his clients as much as possible. And with Jodi, because of the interviews that she was doing, there was a lot of video footage to watch. Because she had done so many interviews, and a lot of them were on television, he could easily access that. In regards to that video footage, Kirk took away that she was strange. Nothing that could be defined psychologically, but nonetheless, she was strange. In addition, he felt that she was immature during her police investigations. She would exhibit more childlike qualities and act similar to those of like a restless child. Let's see. Did he go hang around dojos? Oh, in regards to the ninja intruders. Gotcha. Sorry, I don't have my glasses on. And my laptop's a little bit further away from possible. So I was like, wait, what does that say? All right. So even though Kirk was not able to get anything concrete to prove his theory, he held a strong belief that Jodi was the victim of sexual abuse as a child. And this would explain a lot of her behaviors growing up. He goes into a lot about this and why he comes to that conclusion. And I will say, reading that and kind of seeing where he was making those connections in regards to, again, relating it to a lot of his prior experience in work that he had done in his career, I was like, all right, I totally see how he's coming to those conclusions about Jodi. So again, I don't want to get too much into that because I really want everybody to read the book for themselves and get that. But he does go into a lot of detail, which as a reader, I really appreciated. He wasn't just like, here's what I think. Now let's move on. He's like, well, no, let me break it down so you understand why I came up with that. So love that as a reader. So Kirk's first thoughts on Jodi Arias's booking photo. We've all seen her booking photo. She was smiling. She seemed happy. There are so many people who would see this photo, and he had not seen that type of booking photo ever in his career like this, right? And in the end, it didn't really matter to him. All that mattered was how would a jury seeing that photo view that? because ultimately that's going to be what hangs on the death sentence being either put in place for her or not. So Kirk talks about the concept of people thinking about dragging the victims through the mud. And he gets into that a lot because, again, he got a lot of hell from people for representing Jodi as a client. And I think that's one of the things that for a long time, people view defense attorneys in that way. Well, you have your client, but the victim, like, you're going to save your client by dragging them through the mud. And again, reading this, I'm thinking like, oh, like, Kirk, I'm not that reader that's thinking that you're doing this, but I see why he was like, I need to clarify this for the reader. Like, I see that. So he reminds the reader that the United States Supreme Court has mandated that a jury must consider the circumstances of the offense when considering a sentence of death. Meaning, in relation to Jodi's trial, the jury needed to consider the dynamics of the relationship she shared with Travis before a lawful sentence could be rendered. Here's the deal, and Kirk says this throughout the book. Had he not presented such evidence during the trial, Jodi would likely then receive a new trial. So, again, very, very important. So as much as there's stuff that brought up when it's like, oh my God, Jodi's saying that, like, it's total bullshit, right? We all saw the trial. Had Kirk not brought something up when he was defending her, and then later it comes out, now he didn't present that, then that would be ineffective counsel, and she could get a new trial. So it's one of those, like, damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? It's like he was just Kirk put in a horrible position in regards to representing Jodi Arias because of that, right? So the initial review of the evidence related to Travis Alexander. When it came to assessing Travis, the problem was that a lot of the information was inaccurate or contradictory to the other evidence. And some of the examples are that he was Mormon, and one of the things that is practiced there is saving yourself for marriage and virginity. However, he was having very regular sex with Jodi Arias. And there's going to be more that we're going to talk about later in this book. But again, complete contradictory to who he was. Travis was putting out a position that he was wealthy, but when the bank statements were reviewed for the trial, it was very clear that, the image of wealth that Travis is putting out there was very much not what was really happening by his bank statements. And I know it's one of those, like, well, anybody could kind of put that out there, like Instagram versus reality type of thing, right? Right. But when it comes to, okay, here's where we are now, and this is what I'm given to work with, like, every little inconsistency, something where you're like, okay, I got to bring this up. I have to point this out type of thing, right? So the next section of the book is preparing for the guilt phase. So this tells the reader, again, what exactly they can expect. So Kirk had to, again, force the state to hand over a lot of evidence. And a lot of that was text messages. And the state is required to hand over everything to the defense, but they weren't doing that. The state at first tried to say that between Jodi and Travis, there were no text messages, but Kirk went through the court to file a motion, and then the state went to the cell phone company. And wouldn't you know, there were hundreds and hundreds of text messages. So there's that. Travis's texts with Jodi were polar opposite in regards to what Kirk was finding. For example, he would say in text to Jodi, he wanted nothing to do with her and call her all type of things. But then hours later, he would text her and say, you're beautiful and whatnot. Another example is he would call her an evil liar, but then hours later text her about how awesome that she was. So there was just a lot of going through the evidence, like, okay, well, it's just not adding up. It's just complete opposite, right? So the text messages that Kirk had to review were not just between Jodi and Travis, but between Jodi and other people and Travis and other people. And what Kirk discovered was that Travis was sexually active with not just one, but many other women besides Jodi. And besides that, Jodi was flirting with a guy named Ryan, who she was not engaged with in sex with at the time. She was only engaging in sex with Travis. So again, this makes a very different contrast to what was being projected by Travis in life. And again, Kirk kind of takes it back to say, let me make this clear. Anybody is free to have sex with whomever they want and do whatever they want. But in the context of this case, a death penalty case, it all has to be brought in because it's all relevant. So in regards to other types of communications, in order for Kirk to get the emails and other communications, he again had to fight the state by filing another motion because they would not hand it over. These exchanges also provided insight to Kirk about Travis and Jodi's relationship. Most importantly, that Travis was messaging other people and what the context of those messages were. There were messages from both Chris and Guy Hughes to Jodi about how Travis viewed her and treated her. Both of the things had to say about Travis were not very kind at all. And keep in mind, Chris and Guy Hughes were Travis's friend, and they were saying horrible things about Travis to Jodi. And the gist of it was that he hooked up with other girls. He would get their hearts and then get the girls to do whatever he would want. And then once that happened, he would just break up with them. So the emails that Kirk received, here we go. One of the emails was from a Bob White. And that email from Bob White had scanned copies of letters that were reportedly written by Travis about a sexual interest in children, particularly the sexual interest of the son of his friends, Chris and Guy Hughes. And in that same email, like the copy of the letters, it apologized for breaking Jodi's finger. So Kirk met with Chris and Guy Hughes in their home to show them the letters so that they wouldn't be blindsided with it at trial. And while Kirk was not able to get the original letters, a handwriting analysis showed that it indicated it was highly probable that Travis wrote those letters. So Kirk takes a lot of time to answer questions about the letters from Jodi, but those answers are privileged. So it's kind of like, I did a lot of research when it came to these letters, and I talked to my client, Jodi, but what I talked about here, a lot of it I cannot tell you as a reader because it is privileged information. So keep that in mind, but we're going to get back to these letters because during one of Jodi's cell searches, deputies found pens in a 3x5 note card with handwriting on it. And what they found was that she was attempting to copy the handwriting of Travis Alexander. Kirk says that after the 3x5 card was found in Jodi's cell, he believes that Jodi is the one that wrote those letters pretending to be Travis, which horrific. And also, like any mail going out or coming in, like the law enforcement, they all look through it. So I don't know how that would have happened. But I mean, Kirk is very like, he's not making excuses for her and like, oh, well, it could have been coincidence. He's just like, no, I saw that and was like, all right, she probably did it. So there was also an old phone that Jodi had, and she thought the phone was stolen, but it turns out it was only lost, and it was lost within the family car. So the family located it, and they contacted Kirk. Kirk had the phone sent directly to the lab, And there was a lot of audio notes on that phone. And one of them was a few weeks before the killing of Travis, and he was talking to Jodi, where he mentions about traveling to see her in Eureka. So the conversations then moved to the subject of a guy named Abe. And Abe was somebody that Jodi had dated at one point, and they had kissed, and Travis was not happy about this. And keep in mind, this was before Travis. Travis was saying that he wanted to be violent with Abe. So Kirk was like, okay, wait a minute. So either Travis was a jealous person when it came to Jodi, or he viewed her as a possession, or maybe he viewed both of them, right? So the conversation on these messages quickly shifted for Travis and Jodi, and they were talking about sex in graphic terms. As the call continued, that is when the infamous kind of sex tape part, if you will, that we've all heard came about. In a nutshell, the comments Travis made not only once, but twice about Jodi's orgasm, sounding like a 12-year-old girl having her first orgasm. And this was in Travis's own words. So the thing is, when he's referencing underage kids, right, it's evidence. It's evidence that has to be used. And he says, Kirk says, quote, regardless of who is upset, end quote. Because in the end, this is not something that can be taken out of context. Like, this is the victim's own words in conversation with the defendant. So all of this has to be brought up in court. So Kirk would listen to all of Jodi's prison phone calls that she was making or receiving while being held behind bars. And he did this so that if the state tried to use anything against her from any of these calls, he already knew what all of them was about. Nothing was ever used ultimately from the state, but, and when I heard this, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like, I could do like a whole show just on this section of the book because I find it absolutely fascinating. So there was phone calls where Jodi was making them to her mother, and it was very clear how she was treating her mother and how controlling she was, how demeaning she was towards her mom. And then when she spoke to her dad, she was more respectful, but it was very cold. Their relationship was very cold. There were a lot of, this is the part where I'm like, all right, there were a lot of male suitors that would call Jodi, and she would manipulate them into sending her money or books. Overall, Kirk was like, anybody she spoke to on the phone, she was very manipulative, again, to everybody. So let's go back to Jodi's ninja intruder story. Kirk knew that the story, he just flat out says, story was bullshit. Jodi thought she could convince people on the jury of this story, but nonetheless, this is how Kirk had to prepare for trial. Quote, I had to minimize the damage that my client was doing to her own case, end quote. So Kirk, what he did, and this was brilliant, he used a class of undergraduate students to show them the 48 Hours documentary about what she said happened on June 4th, 2008, specifically the ninja intruder story. Needless to say, nobody believed it. With Jodi now being presented this information and knowing this, now she changed her story to self-defense. So the thing is, there's a pause here in regards to the book jumps a little bit. So after the first trial was over, Kirk was saying that Jodi went on doing an interview complaining about Kirk, specifically how certain people could have testified that they saw bruises on Jodi on her arm, but that Kirk, as her attorney, decided not to call these witnesses. So at the time, she was basically bashing him as an attorney for not doing his job. Kirk was upset because he was doing his job, and she was giving these interviews, and it was not only causing damage to her case, but it was also lying about him, and he couldn't respond back. But now with the book, he can respond a little bit. And what he says is there's still a lot that he can't say due to confidentiality. But when she did a lot of these interviews, certain things she would say did waive privilege on the issue. So what he does say is that there was only one actual witness who could offer decent testimony, and that was Matt, Jody's former boyfriend. He came with too much baggage, so Kirk thought putting him on the stand, it would look like he was lying, even if he was in fact just telling the truth. So Matt did claim to seeing bruises on Jody's arm, but he couldn't remember when. And another issue was in those letters about Travis having, an interest in underage children and so on and so forth. The thing is, the possibility was that Matt had something to do with those letters. So had Kirk put Matt on the stand, that could have opened up a whole other thing that would not have worked out well for Jody. So Kirk decided not to put Matt on the stand. The other person that Jody said put on the stand was Sandy, her. And Sandy was saying she supposedly saw these bruises on Jody's arm. But the thing is, when Kirk met with her and was like, all right, let's go over the story, describe to me what you saw, when, so on and so forth. It was clear to Kirk, she was lying to protect her daughter. And she wasn't doing a good job at it. All she could say, I remember seeing the bruises, but I don't remember when. I don't remember what they look like, but I saw bruises. Kirk also did not like Sandy, and he makes that very clear because Sandy accused Kirk of being wanting to leave the public defender's office to start his own practice. So it's like, how could you do that? And also Kirk talks about an incident where he was in Vegas with his wife and he ran into Sandy's son, Carl, so Jody's brother, and his wife. And then on the phone with Jody in prison, Sandy talks about that and refers to seeing Kirk and his wife. And he was like, I don't even want to repeat it, what was said. It was just like disrespectful and horrible, not only to Kirk, but to his wife. And it's like, there was no reason for those comments. So needless to say, because of that, Kirk just does not like Sandy, which don't blame him. Let's see. I kind of want a Ninja Intruder shirt now. Oh my gosh. Still? Well, you don't go looking for ninjas. They're just asking for trouble. I mean, that is true. Was he doing his job, though? We never heard about him looking for the real intruder. I think we all know who the real intruder is. Capone. Come on now. So another guy that Jody was saying, hey, put him on the stand, he'll testify, was a guy named Frank from Prepaid Legal Conference. Jody said that he and another guy talked to Jody and made a joke about the bruises and that Travis was either beating or abusing Jody. So Kirk tracked down this jokester. And he said he did have a conversation with Jody, but not when this Frank guy was present. So that right away is just contradicting the story. But the guy says there was never a mention of any bruising, any beating, or anything between Travis and Jody. Kirk really tried to track down Frank. He could never locate him. And I say Frank with loose quotations. So there's that. So Kirk talks about then traveling to Eureka, California. He had to do so many interviews for witnesses in the trial. And this includes law enforcement, Jody's family, and so many other people. Two of those people that we're going to talk about right now is Miss Reed and Miss Hall. So Miss Reed did admit, and this was admitted at trial, that she did have sex with Travis Alexander one time. So again, what Travis was putting out there and what was actually happening in his real life is completely contradicting. So it wasn't just Jody he was having sex with. Miss Reed, Miss Hall was a friend of Travis's that he had a romantic interest in. The thing was, Miss Hall was a very shy Mormon girl who very strictly followed the rules, even though she was in her 20s. So there was that. But nonetheless, Kirk had to interview both of them. All right, Phil, what are you saying? Is ninjas only natural predators? Samurai? There's no. Oh my God. Fiddle, thank you for that information. That is very helpful in this case. Actually, it is very helpful in this case. So the next section of the book is preparing for the mitigation phase. So Kirk gives a whole chapter talking about mitigation in the sentencing phase in regards to what they are. And again, I found this very helpful as a reader. So this is because the law says that the jury, in making the determination in a death penalty case for sentencing, must consider everything about the person and the circumstances of the offense that is presented to them. So, meaning the defense team must investigate the client's life from conception to present day, everything in between. So Jodi's previous legal team did a really good job in looking back through her life and gathering information and doing interviews. However, not all of these things painted a good picture of Jodi. And a lot of the people that said bad things about her were her own friends and family members. All right. Good night, Auntie Mimi. Hope you're feeling better tomorrow. Let's see. So Jodi's friends, family, whatnot would claim that she abused animals as a child, and she was a weird child who was violent with her mother as a teenager. She was also highly sexual. And then there were some other people that said that she was a quiet but yet talented student. So Kirk goes into detail now about when he went to visit Jodi's hometown in Eureka. He went to talk to the family. And he wanted to get a sense of the aura of the home. And he just overall describes the home as having like a very coldness tone and vibe to it. And basically it didn't feel like a home occupied by people with love and whatnot. It just felt like he was standing in an abandoned home, a home that he said whose blood had left. Kirk recalls talking privately to Jodi's sister Angela, who was about 16 years old at the time. Kirk expected her to be upset about her sister's situation, but instead, Angela was kind of emotionally disconnected from the entire situation. Like there was really no concern at all for her sister, Jodi. And Kirk was like, well, that's just kind of strange, right? Jodi's brother, Joey, he didn't even make it to the meeting to talk with Kirk and his team. Interesting, right? Part of that time that he was there, Kirk spent in the family shed. That is where a lot of Jodi's art was put in, all of her stuff. So yes, it was pretty much like the Arias family was like, okay, she's in jail, she's out of here. Almost like every memory or thing about her that was in the house, they took out and removed and put it in the shed. And she wasn't even convicted yet. So he was just like, that is just weird. Sandy, Jodi's mom, seemed actually very agitated and put out that she had to be there and take a few hours off work to meet with Kirk and his team. However, when Kirk met with Jodi's grandparents, Caroline and Sonny, they were the complete opposite. They clearly had a lot of love for Jodi and concern about her, and their house felt more like a home. The problem was they wanted to help Jodi any way that they could, but it was very clear that Jodi was telling them things to say and how the narration of the conversation should go. And Kirk was like, I can't use a lot of that, right? The thing is, unlike Jodi's family home, the grandparents, there was a bedroom there for Jodi because Jodi would stay a lot of the time. They kept it completely intact. So we're going to talk about cats now. And by cats, meaning singular. Jodi's cat, Luna. And if you're thinking, oh my gosh, yay. Jodi made it very clear to Kirk, when you go to Eureka, spend time with my cat, Luna. Which, like, okay, cat person in me, I'm like, okay, is it? All right, we'll see where this goes. Can't be all bad, right? The thing is that Jodi was like, you need to pet my cat, Luna. And nothing was more important to her for Kirk to get out of that visit to her hometown than to be with the cat. And when Kirk got back and was like, well, here's how it went, blah, blah, blah. And Jodi did not seem surprised that her family pretty much had nothing want. They didn't want anything to do with her. She was not surprised by that. However, she got so angry and so upset that Kirk did not pet her cat, Luna. And he was like, how strange is it that of all his years representing a defendant, he never has had such an irrelevant conversation like he did about this cat. He wanted to say, it's not my job to pet your cat. It's my job to save your life. But Kirk says the ABA guidelines suggest that the attorney attempt to build a relationship with their client. So what Kirk says now at the end of the book, and I was like, all right, I loved this ending of this chapter. I had to hold myself back from saying that I did not give a crap about her cat and that her cat was crazy. Finally, Miss Arias, if you are reading this, please be advised that I do not care about your cat, end quote. Ordinarily, y'all know who I'm a cat girl. I'm like, you know what? I got Kirk's back on this one. I do. So, all right. The expert that the state used for their witness list was a Dr. Janine DeMarti. The court describes how she had very little experience and had not published any academic journals and actually also had no experience in the field of domestic violence. So this report, according to Clark, diagnosed Jodi with border personality disorder. And the thing, y'all, this report also said that Jodi was a slut. How is that a professionally written report? Like, how is that a professionally written report? I was reading that and I was like, okay, there's no way I just read that. I read that wrong. So I reread it and I was like, nope, I sure read that right. So her report, Dr. DeMarti's, did not take into account a lot of things. So what Kirk was like, it seems like they had a conclusion and then just worked their way back to fit that conclusion and just avoided mentioning anything that didn't fit with that narrative. So when the defense team wanted to meet with Dr. DeMarti for a closer look at this before trial, she came across as really cold and arrogant. Like, I don't like being questioned about my conclusions. Is a what? Right? Tony, right? So Kirk now says the next section of the book is when he talks about his decision to leave the office of the public defender. He thought, he would go into private practice with a friend of his, colleague, in that this would, by leaving the public defender's office, ultimately he would be removed from the Jodi Arias case. But that is not how it happened. And it still blows my mind that this was allowed. I'm just like, oh my God, because it presents a lot of issues going forward. And we'll get into that. So he wanted to, again, go into the private practice sector. And there were several reasons for doing that. But he's flat out, straight up honest that leaving the job behind, specifically Jodi, was a big motivating factor for leaving this position. So Kirk had to write a formal motion to withdraw from the case. So he detailed how Jodi tried to fight him on this because she couldn't convince him to do what she wanted, which was basically, hey, put your life on hold and just stay and represent me. So as the week went on, Kirk was sure that he'd be allowed to withdraw from the case in this position because he was going to be leaving the public defender's office. But the judge denied this request. And once that happened, Jodi right away was way more difficult to deal with. He had tried to get away from her and it didn't work. And she knew that. So now he no longer works for the public defender's office, but he still has to defend Jodi in that manner. So a lot of stuff now transitioned and in a very difficult way. He didn't have a secretary anymore, so he had to hire one. He also had to pay for his collect calls from Jodi in prison. Before, didn't have to pay for it, but now he does, which is like, what the heck? Like, I'm angry at that judge for making that decision. I really am, because I'm just like, what the heck? All right. So there's a whole chapter here about the naked pictures that we've all seen from the trial. They're still floating around online. Again, there are no pictures in this book, nor was there any needed. But But by now, a lot of these pictures had been viewed by the public. So what Kirk does is he discusses these photos in the perspective of a defense attorney type of view. So to him, these were not just nude pictures because, again, he'd been used to kind of seeing that type of stuff through other cases. These pictures were more pornographic in nature, which we can all agree, right? But a lot of the pictures, and I totally I feel like I tried to block so much of this case from my mind. And then like when he was discussing some of like the specific evidence in this case, I'm like, oh, I forgot about that. Oh, I forgot about that. This next one was one of them. So some of the pictures were close up, zoomed up photos of Jody's vagina and anus that Travis had taken. Again, they were nude. The photos were nothing new in regards to some cases, but in regards to the media with this case, it took on a whole another level, right? So Kirk, and I actually have a quote here because I found it very, very impactful. He says, quote, as I will likely mention several times over the course of my writings, image was important to Miss Arias. It seemed to me that she cared more about her public image than her life. In contrast, as you read in chapter 2, I did not care about her image. I had a job to do. If I were to venture a guess, I would guess that she would rather be on death row right now with these pictures having remained as private as possible than be serving a life sentence while knowing that the world has seen her vagina, end quote. He says he does understand that the embarrassment that all women might have faced had these types of pictures been put out there. But he describes this case, it was such a unique situation because the woman who was attached to these photos was ultimately an admitted killer. So therefore, these pictures where she does voluntary pose for them with Travis, they're now evidence. And this evidence to Kirk did support her claims about her relationship with Travis and what happened in regards to the day of the killing. Therefore, Kirk needed every piece of evidence he could get to help save his client's life. Now we get to what was my favorite part of the book, where Kirk goes into Jody's self-destructive streak. We know that she battled him on everything throughout the entire time he represented her, but he goes a lot more in depth about some of the examples of the more prominent self-destructive acts that she did. So, oh my gosh, again, my favorite part of the book. I would love to, and I get it. Still, a lot of it is like privileged information. So the examples that he talked about were ones that he could. I almost want to say, Kirk, I would have loved a whole book about her self-destructive streak. Just a whole book in itself. And I get it, like it's kind of mixed throughout this entire book, and I'm sure it's in the next one because that's just who she was. But like, oh my God, this I would have loved more. I would have loved more as a reader, but that's just me. Hey, William Eddie, how you doing? So, for example, one of the things that she did that put Kirk in a position where he actually had to call the Arizona bar's ethics hotline. And I have my note. I did not even know that that existed. So the ethics hotline is a number where attorneys can call and get advice from the bar when they're facing ethical dilemmas that they cannot resolve on their own. After speaking to the bar, the reality of the situation of how he should act. So basically, the bar's position was that if he felt these covert actions would save her life, then he should do it and act on that, because ultimately saving her life was the ethical duty that he had for Miss Arias. Kirk describes a specific situation that forced him and a few other members of the defense to travel to Las Vegas. So again, this is another one of those parts in the book where I'm like, oh, I want more. Like, oh. So there was a phone call, several phone calls from Jody's jailhouse phone call that Kirk became suspicious that she, with the help of another individual, was trying to hide evidence from him. And this person lived in Vegas. They knew Kirk and his team. They knew where this guy lived, so they went to his home. When they showed up, he actually lived with his mother. And the guy was, quote, very intent in unburdening himself of all things Jodi Arias, end quote. Meaning he gave up everything he had in relation to Jodi Arias. Kirk was thinking that maybe up until this point, this guy was in the mindset of like, hey, I'm talking to this girl that's in jail. She's really attractive. However, the reality sets in, and two attorneys and their investigator show up at his door, at his mom's door, because he lives with his mother. So it's no longer just fun and games at this point. It became very real. There was ultimately like the mindset of like, well, maybe no more. This is like of some bizarre sexual fantasy this guy would have had with Jodi that only existed in his head, because the guy really realized, you know what, this is a real case and a real person, and I want no part of it. So I found that fascinating. In the end, Jodi was hiding something from Kirk, but it wasn't really nothing of importance to the case. But again, that just goes to show who she was. You know, here's this attorney trying to save her life, and she's like going behind his back, really just trying to hide everything she can and thinking she's being discreet and getting away with it, and she's not. So chapter 36. So chapter 36, I wanted to point out in the book, is called 9 out of 10 days. We all remember that quote that Kirk did when he was representing Jodi in court. The 9 out of 10 days he does not like Jodi Arias. So he, in this chapter, explains why he does not believe her claims of self-defense and why he did not support what she did on June 4th, 2008. And in this chapter, he also explains why he does not like Jodi. Due to confidentiality, again, he can only explain certain reasons. I will... all right. So he goes into each of these things more, but I'll just say what they are. 1, Jodi was perfectly content to risk ruining Kirk's career by forcing him into a position where he would have to help Jodi make these assertions against Travis. 2, if that attempt failed, she knew he could not get away, and she decided she would treat him any way she wanted because of this. 3, soon after he could not get off her case because the judge would not allow it, Jodi told him that she was going to badmouth him in jail so that no other female inmates would hire him. 4, she then implied that if he did not play ball with her, then the badmouthing would continue even after the trial was over. 5, Jodi had the mindset that she was the boss and he was the attorney working for her, and that he should always be in the office when she wanted him there. 6, and then lastly, in addition to being self-destructive, Jodi was a highly manipulative person who had the abilities similar to those of a cult leader. So, next part of the book, it talks about a shakeup in the defense team. So, an issue arose. Kirk had to file another motion to withdraw. The other teammates, the problem was, so his other teammates still worked for the public defender's office. So again, he left, but the judge wouldn't allow him to be removed from the case. But his other teammates still worked for the public defender's office. Well, their boss did not want them to follow Kirk's direction because he no longer worked for their office. So Kirk's like, I'm being put in a hard position here because I'm trying to lead a team that is being not allowed to follow my directions. So the judge, again, denied this motion, would not allow Kirk to withdraw from the case. Another blow to the trial was that one of the experts working with Jodi's defense became so ill they were not going to be able to testify in the trial. So they were allowed to withdraw from the case. So now, in regards to a witness expert for domestic violence, they no longer had one. So Kirk had to find a new expert in this field. They did find someone, I'm totally going to butcher her last name, Alice Lavoyette. She worked merely as a counselor for those involved in domestic violence relationships. She didn't have a PhD. But after some phone calls, Kirk thought, it would be good for us to meet her in person and for her to meet Jodi personally. And she agreed to do that. So after this, things were getting back on track because she agreed to take on the case. But Kirk then learned that the Office of the Public Defender determined that they had a conflict of interest and they could no longer be involved in representing Jodi Arias because of this conflict. Kirk says he doesn't know what the conflict was. So at the time of this writing, 2015, he never found out what that conflict of interest was. I don't know if now in 2025 he knows what it was or not. But ultimately, now he had no team and he had to rush to find a team. He also thinks Jodi was okay with this because she was not able to make any of those other defense team members to basically do what she wanted. So there's that. So let's see. Kirk now had to find a new team. Jennifer Wilmot agreed to be Kirk's co-counsel prior to winning the case. They had a pleasant but distant friendship. However, after the case, that friendship no longer existed. I felt so bad about this section in the book because Kirk talks about how he wished he never made that call to Jennifer, and for many reasons. Ultimately their friendship ended, but also now Jennifer, again, because you're representing Jodi, nothing to do with you personally, just you're representing Jodi Arias. Jennifer was threatened. Her kids were threatened. Ugly things were being said about her on social media. So her life was forever altered, seemingly for the worse, from taking on this case. Maria de la Rosa joined the team as the mitigation specialist, and Bud joined the team to serve as the investigator. However, Bud passed away towards the end of Jodi's second trial. So Jodi, all right, so there's a quote here that I have. Miss Arias had her new team, and when the time came, Miss Wilmot and I appeared before Judge Stevens so that she could make all the required orders. It was at this time that Jodi met Miss Wilmot for the first time. Ironically, it did not seem as if Jodi liked Jennifer when the first two met. Ironic because of how much that would change over time. And if you're thinking, what's that about? One, if we watch the trial, you know, but that would also, I get into Kirk's second book. So section 8 of the book, we're winding down, folks. Pre-trial issues. So Jodi decided to go what's called pro per. So PRO-PER, pro per. And that means becoming one's own lawyer. Due to confidentiality, Kirk could not discuss a lot of the conversations that revolved around this with Jodi. What he can say was that the judge, per the 6th Amendment of the United States Constitution, so it must allow the defendant to represent themselves. Jodi, after meeting with the judge, was now lead counsel. Kirk was now co-counsel, basically to serve as like an advisory counsel to Jodi. This now meant that the defense's job was to advise Jodi during the hearing if she sought their advice. It also now meant that Jodi's job was to act as her own attorney in all respects. So it was her job to call witnesses, cross-examine witnesses, and to argue her position of all things that an attorney might do for their client. She now had to do all of this for herself. There was the issue now with those letters. Remember, in the 3x5 cards that the prison guards found in her cell. So the handwriting found in the magazines, again, belonged to Jodi. In prison, they were confiscated. Well, they were now being discussed in court during the evidentiary portion of the hearing. So this was going to be damning to Jodi. So Jodi wanted to have the letters admitted. So she got to call witnesses. The first was the defense handwriting expert that Kirk had retained, and a woman named Heather, who for a time lived with Jodi in county jail. Jodi's questions of Heather were geared to prove that Heather had written these things in the magazine. Kirk says nothing that Heather testified or that Jodi asked of her made any sense at all. And it was very clear that Heather was just really going to do whatever Jodi had wanted her to do. When Jodi asked questions about the defense's handwriting expert on the stand, then Jodi shocked everybody by saying something nonsensical about driving a ship, and she did not know how to steer. Then she announced, you know what, it's her desire to resign as counsel. So the judge granted this request. But before she did, when I read this part of the book, I was like, Kirk is a genius for this next part, because he's just like, I'm not allowing this bullshit to continue, right? So he stood and had something to say. The judge clearly didn't want to really hear it, but Kirk said, no, this is being said. He stated that the sooner Jodi resigned from serving as her own counsel, the better. However, he was also concerned about his ability to represent Jodi if she was simply allowed to represent herself when she felt like it, and then have him and his co-counsel take over whenever she didn't want to play anymore. Basically, he felt this would be her strategy every single time she disagreed with Kirk. So, would she ask to represent herself again? Would the judge then say yes? So, which would then put Kirk and his team in a position to have to deal with whatever damage that she would have done, and basically said, well, now you clean up my mess type of thing, right? So Kirk had actually researched the laws surrounding self-representation. And I love Kirk for this. When I read this part of the book, I was like, yes, Kirk, yes. So he wanted to make the point extremely clear that when a defendant makes a second request to represent himself or herself, the court has the absolute discretion and ability to deny the defendant's second request to go pro per for whatever reason. It was for these reasons that before Jodi resigned from representing herself, Kirk requested at the court and advised her of the legal reality so that there would be no issues down the road if she wanted to pull this again. So there's that. Kirk describes to the reader about the first-degree murder charge that the jury could find her guilty of, but that crime could be guilty in one of two ways, either premeditated murder or felony murder. So Kirk gives a whole chapter in the book to what is felony murder versus what is premeditated murder. And he puts it in very simple terms for the reader to get a better understanding of the issues and what the state would have to look at and prove for both things. So very helpful. So let's see. Just to sum it up very basically, but again, he goes into a lot of detail with a lot of examples. So the felony murder rule basically allows a state to charge a person with first-degree murder when they kill a person when they are in the course of committing another serious crime or when they are fleeing the scene of that crime. So Kirk didn't understand why the state did the felony murder charge. The state, perhaps out of concern that they could not prove premeditated first-degree murder. The thing is, they also charged Jodi with the same crime via felony murder rule. So it's like they're playing both sides, right? So Kirk challenged the alternative way of charging first-degree murder. He challenged them to disclose what the underlying crime was. The state did not do that, nor did they want to. However, one of the underlying principles in the United States is that a person who is charged with a crime is entitled to know what charges are against them. Juan Martinez, the prosecutor that we all remember from this case, then decided to say that the underlying crime was burglary, and this made no sense to Kirk. So he challenged those charges against Jodi in this manner. The state, however, disagreed with Kirk. They responded, arguing that the underlying felony related to the murder, and because she committed the murder, that she could be charged with felony murder. Kirk says, again, so the judge denied this, and Kirk's just like, wait, this doesn't make sense. And Kirk laid out everything so simply where I'm like, okay, I follow this. And I'm like, I don't follow that reasoning, but he doesn't follow the reasoning either. So there's that. So basically, if you're thinking, why does this matter? It now gave the state two ways to get first-degree murder convictions against Jodi, when it only should have been available for them to get one. This also gave a way for the state to eliminate the lesser included offenses of second-degree murder or manslaughter, crimes that Jodi could not be sentenced to. So Kirk has a chapter in this book about trying to settle the case and come to an agreement with the state. Juan Martinez, however, we know how he was with this case and how other cases he has prosecuted. And he has a reputation for not necessarily resolving a case with a plea deal. He prefers to go to court. So Needless to say, this didn't work. Kirk makes it a point to say if the right plea could have been negotiated, things could have ended quickly and quietly. And Kirk made it clear to the state, Jodi was going to claim that her victim, Travis Alexander, was an abusive pedophile who she had to defend herself. So Kirk made it clear, like, here's how my client's going to argue it. Like, let's just end this. And the state didn't want to do that. So with all the media coverage leading up to the trial, Kirk's only concern was ultimately, will Jodi Arias get a fair trial? He did not care about her image. He was willing to let her public image suffer if it would increase the odds of saving her life. And again, everybody is entitled to a fair trial at the end of the day. And I do agree with that. So Kirk, in regards to the media, a lot of them wanted to speak with him, and he was not having that, right? One of the requests that he did was to get a change of venue. Another request that he did was to sequester the jury. In the end, both of those motions were denied. So now the plan was to select a jury. In November 2012, looked like this was now going to be when it was going to happen. It became clear that the case was not going to settle with the state, right? And we just talked about that. So again, as we're winding things down for the first book, Kirk kind of describes, all right, this is what we've talked about so far in this book. This is all of the evidence I have in front of me. This is what's going to be put in front of the jury. He gives the reader what he believes happened on June 4th, 2008. And he makes there's a caveat to that. This is the theory that he had before the trial began. And then he then talks about, or we'll talk about later in the second book, what the theory will be after. So again, he makes it clear what I thought going into the trial happened and what happened after. Like, it completely switched. He states, again, before trial, quote, I believed that Miss Arias's motivation to kill Mr. Alexander did not arise until after she arrived at his home. Specifically, he believes that when Jodi went to say goodbye to Travis, he made it obvious to her that he wanted her out of the house before anyone saw her. Travis made it obvious to Jodi they were done having sex, so they were done hanging out. Kirk believes that Jodi felt used by Travis and felt that she might have blown her chances over Ryan Burns because of this. So Kirk believes she felt like this toxic relationship. Basically, she wanted to put a stop to it. So in Kirk's mind, Jodi decided right then and there in a fit of rage to put an end to the relationship. In regards to how Jodi killed Travis, Kirk thinks that once Jodi decided to kill him, she grabbed the gun. In response to the gun being pointed at him, Travis leapt towards Jodi in an effort to knock it out of her hand. When this happened, Jodi fired the gun and shot Travis in the face. After this, Travis still alive. Kirk thinks at this point the gun jammed, so Jodi went to grab a knife. At this point, Travis gets on his feet and looks in the mirror to assess in the bathroom mirror what has happened. At this point, Kirk believes Jodi began stabbing Travis in the back, and then Jodi stabbed Travis in the chest during a struggle in the bathroom. Travis made it down the hallway to try to get away, but ultimately fell at the end of the hall where Jodi slit his throat. Then Travis was dead and Jodi dragged his body back down the hall. So I know I just read a lot of graphic information in kind of a graphic theory here. I will say typically I don't give that much of a graphic insight in regards to cases, but again, where I'm trying to do a deep dive book review, I felt that was warranted for this episode. Again, that was just one of the paragraphs that I quoted here. Kirk goes into a lot more detail in regards to his theories here, but I just want to give you guys a little bit of what he thought happened. So Kirk has a chapter on what he believes that the state would argue. One of the things he noted was that at no time did the state try to assess why Jodi did this. So the why was still a question that the state had not been able to fit into the factual scenario that they had. So the state had to basically try to come up with, Jodi had some sort of plan that was in place when she pulled up to Travis's home. To sum it up, they were, what Kirk was expecting the state to do was say that Jodi stole the gun from her grandparents, went on a covert mission to kill Travis. And this mission included, these are things we all know from the trial, driving to Redding, California to rent a car, to then drive that car to Mesa with the intent on killing Travis. He also added he believed that the state was going to argue that the reason Jodi did not kill Travis when she first got there was because she wanted to wait for the right opportunity in moment when Travis was most vulnerable before she would kill him, and that would make it more easy for her to do. Kirk again says if he had it his way, Jodi would not have told the stories about Travis. And he just flat out says, if I had it my way, she would never have taken the stand. And this is where the book ends, just before the trial starts. So I just threw a lot of information on you guys again, and this is part 1 of 3. So the next book is, let me move that back. The next book is part 2 and 3 is in one book. So my overall feedback, I do very much recommend this book for everybody to read. It is very easy to read. I was able to understand as a reader a lot from Kirk about the legal system, and he put it very simply. Throughout the book, he talks to the reader, and he's very upfront in saying, I understand why you as the reader, or why the public was so mad at me or took things this way at this point. Let me explain why I had to, or why X, Y, and Z. So on the one hand, I loved that he knew what he was up against with the readers at the time this book came out in 2015. So on the one hand, I'm like, I commend him for saying, like, he knew he was writing something hard that wasn't going to be a popular read or people agreeing with him, if you will. But then I also, like I said earlier, felt really sad, and like, I read this thinking, you don't need to defend yourself to me in that regard. Like, I just want to hear what the experience was like for you. But I get why so many people were so angry at him. I was never one of those people, because at the end of the day, it's a job and everybody's entitled to a defense. Again, not saying anything Jodi did was right or justified in any way. Or do I like her at all? No, not at all. Not at all. But I get why he had to defend himself in that way. Again, as I mentioned, the way the chapters are broken out, it's very easy for the reader to sit and read a lot in one go, or there's multiple like stop points between each chapter where if the reader was like, okay, I can only read for like 15 minutes, you can get a lot in, and then there's easy stopping points for the reader to do. At the beginning of each section, Kirk has a page describing what was going to be in the upcoming chapter in that section. And again, it's about a sentence or two. I know I mentioned that earlier on. This was really good as the reader because I knew what was going to happen in the next upcoming section of, like, maybe there was 5 or 6 chapters in that section. I liked how I got to know more about Kirk. I felt that I could, as I mentioned at the beginning, I felt like I could relate a lot to him and his upbringing, his education, his work ethic in regards to working and supporting himself through school, in regards to going to school for psychology. He has a love of pets, love of animals, love of dogs. I have my, love of cats. There was just a lot where I'm like, all right, I feel connected to him, that we have similar values or work in life experiences in that way. Again, as I mentioned, while I, in this episode, would say Jodi and Travis throughout the entire book, it is always Miss Arias, Mr. Alexander. And he makes it clear it's for, especially for Mr. Alexander, out of respect for him. Kirk would explain the legal system and the defense team job in detail. Again, this was Arizona based. And I have my note. This was very helpful because I do not know Arizona law. I am from Massachusetts. So Arizona law is foreign to me, and he did a good job of explaining it. So as a reader, I felt like, okay, knowing what was required or what was expected and why, now I know certain steps were taken for those reasons. Throughout the book, Travis was viewed in a very sensitive and respectful way from Kirk. And it shows in every single chapter. And Kirk has those moments where, yes, he's describing it as the defense attorney perspective, but also as just a human being. And you always get that respect towards Travis throughout the entire book. And let's see, a couple other points. Some of the highlights was the importance of defense attorneys in regards to defense attorneys in regards to doing their job in death penalty cases. Kirk says he would go more in depth in the next book, and he shows the reader that he's not glossing over everything. So again, where I left right here, I was like, oh, I want the next book like now. Some of the questions that Kirk poses to the reader were ones that kind of make you think, and I have some feelings on it, and I'll get into that. So, for example, some of the questions, and I get it on this end, this book was published in 2015. So some of the questions that he has towards some of the people, I guess, probably reading this are people that are judging him and hating him simply because of his job. Nothing to do with Kirk personally, but because of his job. And so like certain questions throughout the book, and it's just sprinkled here and there, it's not a lot, was like, for example, kind of like what makes you think as a spectator that you would know more than like this particular expert that they're referencing, right? And on the one hand, I was like, oh, like I'm not taking that personally because, again, I'm not questioning anything that the author Kirk Nurmi is describing, but I feel like I hate that he has to defend himself in that way, that he was viewed the way he was because of just simply who his client was. But then again, the questions that he's posing are absolutely valid and actually completely spot on. You know, here's people saying, oh, I can't believe this. And it's like, well, wait a minute. How do you know more than this expert? That's fair. That's fair. Just, well, I sat there and watched the trial from, every single day. I would get out of work early and watch. Well, no, that doesn't make you an expert. And that's just me, giving my own little shtick there. But it's like, come on. Kirk makes an excellent point there. So Kirk talks about the crime scene throughout the book, specifically what happened to Travis in regards to what the evidence shows, and then what he thinks happened. The stab wounds, the defensive wounds, the gunshot. Again, but he doesn't, when he describes what happened to Travis, it is not in a kind of gory or sensational way that in regards to some true crime books would represent that information. This was more of a very, you could tell it was a factual defense attorney kind of perspective, but still had to put that out there. And again, this was no information that was new to us because so many of us are familiar with this trial, but nonetheless, he does give that a lot of information. He also makes it clear that what he believes happened during the initial assessment when he got the case is different than what he believes happened when the trial began and then when the trial ended. And I commend Kirk for not using a single photo in this book. Not a single one. I think that was a very smart artistic choice and not needed because Jodi does not need any more attention than she has already received in her life. Lastly, Kirk did everything he could to try to save his client's life. Meanwhile, she was always making his job harder. We will, again, there's part 2 and 3 where as we know, once the trial began, it didn't stop here with her making his life difficult. So there's going to be more. And then there was a quote that Kirk used throughout the entire book at certain parts, and it was, quote, "Facts are stubborn things," end quote. And I absolutely loved that quote, and he used it at just the best times in the book. So that is my overall book review for September's book club review. Again, the book voted on this month was Trapped in This Arias, part 1 of 3, From Getting the File to Being Ready for the Trial by L. Kirk Nurmi. So if you have any questions or comments about this book, please leave a comment and let me know. If you've read this book, what are your thoughts on it? Let me know. Have you read the second and third part of the book? Let me know, because I have not read it yet, and I'm very, very curious. So thank you, everybody, for sticking around and joining me for this episode of Dani After Dark. And my apologies again for the technical difficulties at the beginning. I'm hoping it's like every time I off camera, when I'm like, all right, fixing around, and I'm like, all right, I think I got it fixed. I think it's good. And then I go live and it's like, oh, still buggering me. So my apologies for that. There will be no True Crime and Chill this weekend. I was thinking where I could squeeze it in to make it work, but based on my schedule, is just, there's no opportunity for it. So my apologies. So y'all have the weekend off with that. But again, I post a ton on Instagram. So anytime there's kind of like breaking news of some of the major stories, I will share that on Instagram and my Instagram story. So check that out. All right. So in the meantime, everybody, hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have not read this book, I suggest everybody read it. It is an excellent read, and a great perspective from a defense attorney. We don't always get that. And I think especially with such a high profile case, this is one that's like, it's a must read. It really is. So, all right, everybody, in the next couple of days, I will post a poll for October's book club book review. So be on the lookout for that. Vote for that. I will put the Trapped in This Arias part 2 and 3 one. I'll put that in there in case people are kind of like riding on this and they're like, all right, we want to know now what happens in part 2 and 3. So I'll throw that in there. But until then, everybody enjoy the rest of your evening. Have a great weekend. And remember, until next time, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us. Bye, everyone.